in the sense that Michael and I have been talking for a while, and met yesterday to figure out how to interleave our slides. So we do have different points of view, but you're not going to see too much bloodshed. May not even see the slides. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I don't have any financial disclosures, and Michael, as you see, is a consultant to the U.S. Health Research Services Administration and grant reviewer for U.S. Department of Defense. And we're not going to talk about off-label things. So I'm going to start by referring to the fact that we want to talk about conceptual developments in cerebral palsy and how our thinking about cerebral palsy influences how we talk about it, how we think about it, how we approach treatment, how we approach management, and to posit that CP is an idea rather than a disease. And I think that's a notion that people in this audience understand, and probably a very important idea for people to share with families and with colleagues who think about CP as if it is a singular disease. And I was telling Michael that a colleague of ours talks about all the alphabet soup of conditions we deal with as adjectives parading as nouns, which I think is a brilliant description of the fact that we really talk about these conditions with capital letters and make them into things when they probably aren't actually things. So Michael's going to tell you what he means by genetic.
Okay, and so just to set the stage a little bit, I think that for the purposes of this discussion, what we're really focused on is a little bit different than what Lou was just telling us about. And so the CP genetics, or the potential contribution of genomic and genetic influences to cerebral palsy, is in a transition period. That's the very subject of this debate. But what we're talking about this morning is really those rare, highly penetrant changes in the genetic code that might actually be causative of the disease in an individual, or the condition in an individual. And so I think by analogy, every one of us has a genetic makeup, a genetic blueprint, if you will. You can think of our genome, as it's commonly discussed, really as a cookbook, a set of recipes that tells our bodies how to make a human being, one of us. And there are roughly 20,000 of these genetic recipes in every one of us. Those genetic recipes are in turn comprised of DNA. They're written in this DNA code. And that DNA code then tells each individual cell how to go about and make a particular protein in our bodies that carries on a very specific function. So you can think about that recipe, for example, telling our bodies how to do something akin to making a cake. And so the topic of mutations come up when whole pages are actually torn from that recipe book, interfering with our ability to interpret that recipe and to make that cake correctly. And similarly, if there's a typo, a genetic misspelling that can sometimes occur in one base pair out of 3 billion, that can sometimes be enough to affect how that recipe turns out. Again, by analogy, if you're making a cake and you don't know if your recipe calls for 1 egg or 3 eggs, that can affect the way that your cake is going to turn out. Another concept that we wanted to introduce early on is the concept of cerebral palsy as a major neurodevelopmental disorder. And so if you look at the different domains of development, look at cognitive, physical, language, and social emotional development, autism, intellectual disability, these are known to affect specific domains. Cerebral palsy is known to affect an additional domain. And we bring this up specifically because research in other forms of neurodevelopmental disorders are in many ways ahead of what we know about genetics and cerebral palsy. And in particular, we know that intellectual disability and autism have a strong genetic contribution. So there's been lots of exciting work going on in the intersection of cerebral palsy and genetic. And I throw up this slide not to point out very specific line items, but just to make the case that our studies have now advanced to the point that we're able to look with a great deal of statistical rigor at these possible genetic contributions to CP. And so this is taken from our upcoming paper looking at approximately 250 trios of individuals with cerebral palsy. And what the evidence shows, the statistics show us, is that de novo mutations, mutations that come up out of the blue and are not found in either mother or father, but are seen in the affected child, represent a major risk factor for CP. And so this is strong statistical evidence that there is an association of genetic variants, mutations, with cerebral palsy. And in fact, in this particular cohort, although we are comparing apples to oranges to some extent, I think it's worth recognizing that fully 12% of the cases in our cohort could be potentially explained by an excess of damaging de novo variants. And so this is quite interesting to someone like me when you think about the data that exists that suggests that perinatal asphyxia might only be present in 8 to 12% of cases of CP. And by analogy, MRI technology may prove instructive. So years ago, with the introduction of MRI into clinical practice, the ability to look in detail at brains of individuals with cerebral palsy allowed us to better understand the causes of cerebral palsy than ever before. So in many children that had previously had CP of unknown cause, getting that MRI scan allowed us to identify patterns of injury to the developing brain that allowed us to ascribe a tentative cause. And similarly, genomic technologies are now really allowing us to scan the genome rather than the brain and perhaps identify additional genetic causes of CP. But I wanted to introduce a controversy that currently exists in the field. This is an outstanding paper that was recently published in Annals of Clinical and Translational Neurology. And this paper has been hotly discussed lately because, as you can see in the title, genomic analysis identifies masqueraders of full-term cerebral palsy. The implication here is that these children don't, in fact, have cerebral palsy. And in fact, the paper itself stated recent studies have suggested that genetic disorders can be misdiagnosed as cerebral palsy. At this point, we wanted to turn it over to you guys and start the debate. So audience, what do you think about this? Please speak up. Would you mind using the microphone?
Gordon Worley, Duke University. Cerebral palsy is a clinical diagnosis. It's not a genetic diagnosis. You can have any number of etiologies, as everyone in the room knows.
All right, debate over.
What he said. The idea that having a genetic abnormality or difference precludes the diagnosis of cerebral palsy is just wrong.
It's Jody Kowski from Cooperstown, past president. I'd like to go back to what Peter Rosenbaum said at the beginning of his talk, which is critical. And cerebral palsy is really a constellation of presentations. I mean, when I would do clinics, many times resident would come to me and say the patient has a diagnosis of cerebral palsy or had cerebral palsy. And my response was, well, what's the diagnosis? Because cerebral palsy is a very wide spectrum, and coriform athetosis is a diagnosis. A microdeletion of chromosome 5 is a diagnosis. And so I've always looked at cerebral palsy as being this wide grouping of people who have issues to do with central nervous system dysfunction, injury, or malformation. And so I really see this, I go back to what Peter said, and cerebral palsy itself may not be the diagnosis. It may be that microdeletion is the diagnosis. It may be the intrauterine cerebrovascular accident is the diagnosis.
So just quickly, in response, I guess I would ask, is microdeletion of chromosome 5 the diagnosis, or is that the etiology?
Well, it's etiology, yes, but on the same token, I've had several kids come in to see me with things like micro deletions, and clearly they have central nervous system dysfunction, which involves both learning disabilities and perceptual or sensory disabilities, which all go with the constellation of cerebral palsy, and then they'll do a genetic analysis of the parents, and one of the parents will have the same microdeletion, have none of the symptoms, have none of the presentation that their child does. So it is complex, and that's why I think of cerebral palsy as really a constellation, like I think Peter presented at the beginning of his talk.
Michael, I just want to present a very practical approach. Most ICD-10 recognition of a cerebral palsy diagnosis, if you have the clinical picture, will allow you access to many different services and possible DME, where if you code a diagnosis with a microdeletion, nobody really understands the impact to function. So I think that from a rehab perspective, it's very important to understand the impact on function as well as the etiology. And the etiological explosion is tremendous, but the real impact at the family level to get a bath chair or a wheelchair is really dependent on an accurate functional diagnosis, or not that CP is a functional diagnosis, but it allows you to provide the medical necessity for that. So if you think about provision of services, CP is a very powerful diagnosis.
Peter, all of our plants in the audience are working perfectly.
I would just like to add that on top of what she just said about the diagnosis for treatment and equipment, but the diagnosis gives the family something to wrap their head around. When they don't know what it is or why it is, they get a diagnosis of CP, and it gives them something to plan for, like how they can plan to adapt and live and participate around this and what it's going to look like now and in the future.
Great point. I know we have a number of additional folks that want to make comments, and we want to hear those. But I just wanted to extend an invitation if there are any members of the author group for the prior paper that I just mentioned. We'd love to hear from you as well and hear your perspective.
Hi, I'm Haginoya from Sendai, Japan. I'm a corresponding author of this paper, and yeah. First of all, the title of our paper was CP genetics of CP cerebral palsy, but reviewers of many papers commented on our paper. This is not cerebral palsy is not genetic. So you need to use masqueraders or other terms. So
they had to change the title?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Michael Masala, University of Chicago. Excellent framework to set us up. But I would just ask the audience, given that our epidemiological data seems to suggest that onset is in the developmental period, including prenatal, including first trimester, why would it surprise us not to have genetic variants that determine how white matter is connected, how basal ganglia signal and work, what my various pathways do? And the problem is always the level of analysis. You can have intact brains that on the surface look good in structure, but there are genetic events occurring that are at a synaptic and a connectivity level that you can't see. The most important reason to do this is most of CP we don't know. We have to quit blaming obstetricians, we have to quit blaming mothers, and we have to quit blaming events that aren't in people's control.
And just to piggyback on that question, although it's not the focus of this talk, the data that's starting to accumulate in cerebral palsy genomics is really suggesting that some of those key neurodevelopmental pathways are the ones that are being impacted very early on.
I'm Maureen O'Donnell from Vancouver. So I personally think that we can have a etiologic diagnosis that helps us, or an understanding of the etiology of the condition that allows us to have very important information for families and for the teams that are working with the child. But we can also have a phenomenologic diagnosis and description, so that's what I think. But I can tell you that it happens on a regular basis, that I see children in our tone management clinic where the parent comes and says, oh, he doesn't have cerebral palsy anymore, because now we know what he's got. And who knows about that disease in your team?
Yeah, it's very interesting perspective, and I think if I can call Sarah McIntyre out just for a moment, we had a similar discussion at the Australasian CPDM, and one of the things that Sarah mentioned to me was that in her registry work, she often finds that, or sometimes finds that parents will say, oh no, my child doesn't have CP, he had a stroke. And so there's this dichotomy sometimes between etiology and between phenomenology.
I'm Bernardin masquerading as myself. So I do think a diagnosis is supposed to be a reduction, but rather something in a way of clarification. So I think that links is really what's important, and they're putative. I don't think even when you do find something, even that deletion, you can say, this is what it is, but you have a hypothesis. I just want to congratulate you on the metaphors, and just note that when you drew a parallel between MRI scanning and genetic scanning, what I find interesting is many of my colleagues, when they saw a normal MRI, said, well, this is not CP. When they saw abnormalities, they said, oh, this confirms this is CP. And you're suggesting just a mirror image for genetics.
In the back.
Yeah, good morning, I'm Karim Abusnene from Israel. If these genomics are, so far as I understand, recessive character, so when it will become dominant genomics?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
If these genomics so far, I assume, hold a recessive character in phenotype, so when you expect them to be a dominant for my grandchildren's and so forth, the futures?
Yeah, and if we have time, we'll get into some of the inheritance a little bit later on, but the accumulating data suggests that recessive inheritance is a part of genetic forms of CP, if there is such a thing, but also that dominantly inherited forms, and in particular de novo variants, where neither the father nor the mother has the genetic mutation, but it's picked up along the course of neurodevelopment in the child. It's estimated that roughly 100 genomic variants arise in each generation, and if one of those is damaging and leads to mutation, it could lead to CP.
Hi, Jeff McLaughlin, Seattle. Just to put it in a slightly different way, I agree completely with what Mike Massal said. The confusion over cerebral palsy over the years came from the fact that for a long time people weren't looking for possible genetic causes, and everything was laid on the poor obstetricians. But once in a while, even the feds get it right. What are the major developmental disabilities that are funded? Autism, intellectual disability, epilepsy, blindness, somebody else can fill in the rest, and cerebral palsy. And all those others, we don't have this argument. Everybody says, okay, that kid's got autism because, and we ought to be doing that routinely in every kid with CP. So we really need to continue looking at genetic mechanisms and understand those.
Well, thanks for your comments. And along those notes, we're very fortunate. Our group recently partnered with the Cerebral Palsy Research Network, and we're just funded by the NIH to do a large-scale genomic study of cerebral palsy.
Hi, I'm Ed Purvis from Ann Arbor. I think we have to be willing to change. You know, we have a certain model here. We like treating cerebral palsy. The idea of having this syndrome that we call cerebral palsy, having more than one diagnosis, means that we're going to have to change the name of the academy, much longer name. I don't think we want to do that.
We could call it the American Academy of Static Encephalopathy with Spastic Quadriplegia.
We could, but not all the kids I treat have that either. So it gets a little complicated. It means I'll have to check off more boxes on Epic and that kind of thing. But you know, some of the comments I'm hearing here. So I remember I did a rotation once when I was a student in Pennsylvania. And every child under the age of 9 who had a disability had cerebral palsy, whether they had muscular dystrophy, whether they'd been in a car accident. And it was for the exact reason that Dr. Gabler mentioned, that's just, they only paid for cerebral palsy. That was the only disability in Pennsylvania in the 1980s. And they have grown up, they've changed, and maybe some of us have to also.
Kind of echoing.
This should be probably the last comment, sorry, before we move on to the next set of slides. But please go ahead.
Kind of echoing some of those comments, I kind of feel like we're in the same era as Nelson and Ellenberg, when we were getting more and more information about the role of perinatal factors, pre and perinatal factors in the etiology of cerebral palsy. So I think it's really exciting, and I think we have to be open to this. And as a clinician, I can tell you, even though it's confusing, I think it's very helpful for parents when, in the absence of neuroimaging, positive results on neuroimaging and/or the lack of perinatal or prenatal risk factors, when you can point to something that they can identify as a possible etiology for their child's disabilities.
Thank you.
Well, clearly you figured out what the trick is in something like this. Is 5 minutes of introduction and then open it up. Most of what we were going to say has been said, and I think in quite important ways. Among the things that have been said, I want to pick on what Deb said, is that the political nature of a diagnosis, having the right label, either opens doors or closes doors, and that's one of the many, many implications of this kind of a conversation. I'm going to go very quickly through what people already know, which is that cerebral palsy, and this is the definition that was arrived at by a group of people started in 2004, published in 2007. It's a group of permanent disorders of the development of movement and posture causing activity limitation that are attributed to non-progressive disturbances that have occurred in the developing fetal or infant brain. And they're often accompanied by disturbances of sensation, etc. And all of you know this. And so we think of CP, and in fact, Michael's already alluded to this, it's one of the prototypes, perhaps classically a prototype of neurodevelopmental impairment. I think what's important is that the definition is agnostic with respect to causation, and several of the comments from the audience have made that point. And that has not always been so. There are a lot of very, very, very wealthy lawyers who spend a lot of time on their yachts bought with the money they got winning lawsuits against unsuspecting obstetricians and family doctors because of our traditional concept that cerebral palsy was caused by perinatal asphyxia. And again, the comment has been made already that as we have watched the evolution of this story and parsed these things, we're becoming more and more aware of the complexity of the causal pathways. And I don't think that obstetricians are being blamed nearly as much. We also talk about non-progressive disturbances that occur in the developing fetal brain, and there's no specification as to what factors do or don't or should or shouldn't be included. So the question then becomes, and the question that Michael's going to address, is the role of genetics. And the question, does the understanding of the genetics of CP, or for that matter of autism or intellectual disability, help us grasp causation? Does it help us grasp management issues? Does it help us with counseling families? And again, there's been some allusion to this already. And in what ways? And so I think these are the kinds of understandings of how the frontier, the quickly moving frontier of genetics will help us to move things forward. And so that always, as usual, many of you know this is one of my favorite slides, we have to decide what the question is and who's asking. And this, of course, is the classic metaphor for that, that kind of an issue, and one that Michael was going to use, only I got there first. So the question of diagnosis has been made already. There is no pathognomonic radiological, biochemical, or electrophysiological test of CP. CP is essentially a clinical diagnosis based on a combination of qualitative or quantitative issues that trigger us in delay in the acquisition of milestones, and qualitative features that allow us to say, yes, this milestone is impaired, and there are clinical findings that make us think that there's something wrong in the way in which neuromotor control is being experienced, and functional impacts. And I think that was one of the important contributions to the 2004 definition, that there's an impairment as well. And somebody alluded to Karen Nelson's work, children who outgrew cerebral palsy. Well, they very clearly never had it. What they had were some impairments that are often also seen in cerebral palsy. So the functional impairments are part of what we talk about. And the question is, can a genetic understanding of these issues improve matters for us? We like the ICF, and I won't go into this in detail except to say, to add in the genetic issues, to think about how genetics influences body structure and function, and also probably environmental factors. And so is it genetic or is it CP? It's a silly question to ask it that way. And I took psychology with Donald Hebb, a famous Canadian psychologist, who said that this was like arguing about which was more important to the area of a field, the length or the width. They're clearly interactive. You can use that. And so does this change how we think about CP? Let's have a geneticist help us.
All right, so I wanted to start up the debate again, which has been phenomenal, by just telling a brief story. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to speak at the Spectrum of Developmental Disabilities meeting at Hopkins on our work on the intersection of CP and genetics. And I got a fantastic question from the audience. And a developmental pediatrician raised her hand, and she said, you know, I find your work intriguing. She's like, I actually had a very similar experience recently. And she spoke of a family that she was evaluating their child for autism. And after several visits, she sat the family down to talk to them and relay the diagnosis of autism. And as she was doing so, the mother kept shaking her head and shaking her head. And eventually the physician asked her, she said, is everything okay? She thought she was having a difficult time receiving the diagnosis. And the mother said, yes, but my child doesn't have autism. And the geneticist warned us that you would do this. My child has CHD8 syndrome, not autism. And so I thought that analogy was very apt and very appropriate to what we're dealing with in the CP world. It's been said also in the autism field that if you've seen one child with autism, you've seen one child with autism. And so I think that also applies across the neurodevelopmental disorders. And so on that note, I guess we wanted to open it back up to the audience again, specifically with the question, do patients with genetic causes explaining their symptoms still have CP? And, all right, we'll do a simple show of hands. Who says yes? So do patients with a genetic etiology, a genetic finding that seems to explain their symptoms, who have been clinically diagnosed with cerebral palsy, do they still have CP? It's not progressive. Okay, and by show of hands, who thinks that they do not? That's a brave hand. Do you want to make any comments?
Hillary Gwynn, Kennedy Krieger Institute, which you just acknowledged. So we do a ton of this, and the thing that's come up is that we do occasionally get some disorders, some genetic disorders that are progressive, and that is the big problem for us with the CP versus a progressive disorder issue, because we're not certain, you know, until we've got that workup underway and get our answer, we are a little hesitant to give that first diagnosis of CP if it could be progressive. It's happening often enough that it's a concern.
Okay. So do you, as a follow-up question to you, Hillary, do you, at Kennedy Krieger, do you ever revise the diagnosis of CP if you do?
You know, we don't, and the reason is because of what everybody said here in terms of getting services. The other issue that, you know, I think we have to confront over time is that when we get one of these genetic diagnoses, like the mother who said, you know, my child has this, the descriptions we have of these diagnoses are incomplete. They're all, I mean, I often am getting a diagnosis. There are 15 other individuals on Earth who've been identified with this, and they have a profile, they have some, you know, a little bit of behavioral information, a little bit of something, but it's not even close to what's probably really going to describe that individual over time. And when we do get these descriptions, the fit is remarkable, and that's the other thing that's really scary about it. So it makes me feel that as we get more information over time, we're going to have the ability to discern whether these things, you know, most important to me as a neurologist is the progressive issue. And unfortunately, I think the structures that are in place for supporting individuals with disabilities have not come close to keeping up with this science or the ability, you know, I have to keep that diagnosis of CP, even knowing in the back of my head that that might be not the most appropriate diagnosis for someone that I know is going to have degeneration in their third decade.
Very well stated. Did you want to make a follow-up comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important aspect of this to discuss, because I've had the exact same experience recently of two young children who clinically fit the diagnosis of CP. Both were outliers, gave them the diagnosis of CP. So we probed further and ultimately got genetic diagnoses that are, at least in the historical literature, progressive and degenerative. And it does pose a challenge. Particularly in sort of contrast to the current movement of trying to make early diagnoses of CP, you know, in order to provide early services as much as possible. It's an interesting dilemma, and I kind of appreciate your implication that maybe you change your mind, that you consider changing a diagnosis. You know, you make a diagnosis based on best evidence right now to provide what you think is appropriate right now, and that might change in the future.
And that's exactly what we do in our clinics at this point in time. You know, we in full disclosure, we share what we know with the families, including the limitation, you know, of our knowledge at this point in time with what are often very rare individual disorders.
Yeah.
Michael Massal again. I think it's important that if someone had CMV, we wouldn't say they just have CMV, but if they met criteria for CP, we'd say they had CP secondary to CMV. And the reason I bring up a virus is that all viruses are, in terms of their mechanisms, are packets of RNA or DNA that integrate and cause certain kind of things to emerge. So the most important thing that the collaborative perinatal study showed is that rubella matters, because nobody knew the spectrum of rubella till you did it on a population level. The placenta matters, and malformations matter. If someone has congenital heart disease and CP, do we say they don't have CP because they had congenital heart disease, whose symptoms we recognized first?
Well stated.
Warren Marks, Cook Children's, Fort Worth. You know, some of what we're arguing about is semantics about how you're going to word it. The question is, do you have cerebral palsy because of genetic changes A, B, C, or do you have genetic syndrome A, B, and C manifest as cerebral palsy and other things? So I think some of it is just a matter of how you're looking at it and what you're going to use as your primary diagnosis. Remember, CP is primarily descriptive. So even though we use it as a diagnosis, it doesn't describe etiology.
Hi, this is Marshall Jurgen Alsop from CDC, and thank you for the discussion. I've been thinking about this for a while and very concerned about it as an epidemiologist, because I feel that if we now make diagnoses of children who do fit our clinical criteria for CP, regardless of etiology, we will be artificially lowering the prevalence of CP over time. And from a public health and prevention standpoint, it would be very misleading. So I'm an advocate for continuing to use this umbrella term that we all understand is a clinical presentation, regardless of etiology.
Thank you to all of you out there who are doing a great job of delivering this talk for us. This was one of the points that Peter and I wanted to make in terms of the epidemiologic implications, because, as Warren says, you know, what's in a name, it is semantic to some extent, but sometimes these details, I think, do matter, because, for example, what would happen if we reclassified all of these CP genetic cases? Certainly there are the epidemiologic implications, which are potentially profound, but there are also implications for prevention and treatment, both of which have been touched on as well. So without a diagnosis, a unifying diagnosis of cerebral palsy, it's possible that children might fall through the cracks for various programs, for example, that target them for early intervention and treatment. This could also affect efforts at, surveillance, including hip surveillance, looking at pain, that are focused on, the cerebral palsy group as a whole. On the flip side, I think we've also heard some great reasons why a genetic diagnosis could potentially be valuable. So specifically, if an individual is found to have a very specific gene mutation, especially a single gene mutation, there can be very reproducible phenotypes. There can be manifestations that are very consistent, and having some sense of what to expect can be very, very helpful for that family and the treatment team. And also, that can lead to the potential prevention of complications. So I wanted to go back to the microphones.
Yeah, Alec Hoon, also from Kennedy Krieger. The other incredible chasm is what we know and what the evolving understanding of genetics brings to etiologic diagnosis. A lot of families don't even know what a chromosome is. So when you try to translate this knowledge to a family with a take-home message that's palatable, I find that to be the biggest challenge of all.
It's really tough. It's really tough, especially if you get into topics like variants of unknown significance, or what was already brought up about the limited knowledge we have about the natural history. What do you tell a family if their child is found to have a mutation in a gene that so far has been associated with progressive diseases in all other individuals, but maybe there's only 6 individuals in the world so far that have been found to have mutations in this gene, and this child isn't showing progression.
Yeah, and the other that discussion's on both the cognitive and emotional level. You can have that discuss that this is a genetic disorder, but at the emotional level, the belief systems are often quite different that families bring to the table.
Absolutely.
And Alex, go for it. Yeah. Kat Klasky from Wake Forest, and kind of a related issue, the dilemma I'm having as a clinician with regard to this issue is, how do I deal with the fact that some of my patients have already been diagnosed with well-described genetically based disorders like hereditary spastic paraparesis or Sjogren-Larsen's, and then there are this other group of patients who are having these new rare mutations being revealed by whole exome sequencing, and those are not well described in the literature. And how do I kind of make sense of this dilemma, the contrasting those two types of patients in the cases where they are well described CP masqueraders or with similar CP phenotypes?
Yeah, it's a great question with no easy answers. I think for me, it goes back to the definition that Peter helped formulate and introduced a few moments ago that's familiar to so many of us. If the symptoms seem to fit within the spectrum of what has been defined as CP, then I would typically give a diagnosis of CP, with the caveat that may need to be revised if, for example, that child shows definite progression of his or her symptoms.
Hi, I'm Jan Cockrell from Portland, Oregon. I hear 2 themes. One is kind of a lack of communication between professionals, which I think these kinds of discussions are really important, but we also need to take back to our colleagues locally. The second is maybe not having enough faith in our families that they understand what we're talking about. And I see patients and families who are rural, uneducated, sophisticated, educated immigrants, uneducated immigrants. I see a wide variety. I don't think they have that much trouble understanding these concepts and also understanding that our knowledge is limited.
Sorry, we're going to have to move on in the interest of time.
Les, can I just get in a piece?
I think we can let it slide.
I just, from a point of view perspective, and I mean no disrespect, and the discussion must continue on, but are we not being premature in this discussion? Just to raise that issue, because we look at what is still evolving. Genetics is evolving. Our understanding is evolving, as is good. What we knew of CP 30 years ago or 100 years ago has changed to what has evolved to today in our genetics. What we will look like, perhaps, in time is that the entire spectrum of developmental disabilities, for example, we may have difficulty defining those specific targets, motor CP, intellectual ID, etc. Maybe we will not be able to do that 20 years from now. Maybe it'll all be a piece of what we're talking about. And I think that perspective is something that needs still to be looked at, so that what we are, I think, talking about now is provisional, depending upon where genetics leads us.
I think that's very well stated, and I think that interestingly, there is a very well-known overlap of the neurodevelopmental disorders. We all see that clinically. It's been apparent epidemiologically for some time. And the data from other neurodevelopmental disorders, intellectual disability, autism, epilepsy, clearly tells us that there's genetic overlap. And the most recent data that we have in CP adds CP to that mix and suggests that there's an incredible overlap. To some extent, it goes back to an editorial that Michelle Schusterman wrote in Developmental Medicine and Child Neurology, stating that by looking at any one domain of development and the disorder that affects it, we might be being a little bit too singular and not really looking at the whole child and the spectrum of all of the challenges that he or she faces. I did want to make just a couple of comments. In particular, I think the question as to whether this is premature is a fantastic question. This is coming up more and more often. Is this something where CP genetics is ready for prime time? What should we be doing in our clinics when we see these patients? What should we be telling people? We're in that awkward transition phase, I think, of CP genetics, but the evidence is accumulating, and the strength of that evidence is also accumulating. I think that at this point it's unmistakable that there is a strong genetic evidence to some forms of CP, and how you split that and how you classify that is very much open for debate. One thing that we're very excited about is the fact that we think that CP genetic data may open the door to precision medicine in CP, and at some point we may be able to not only use genetics to help us understand etiology, but to help us to predict who might respond better or not so well to a particular treatment, and ultimately may help us to identify new pathways that allow us to develop completely new medicines for cerebral palsy. And along that route, the International Cerebral Palsy Genomics Consortium was formed almost a couple of years ago now, and is an international group looking at grappling with these questions of how genomics can not only challenge but inform how we think about and how we care for individuals with CP. I think perhaps as a take-home, why don't we just have our cake and eat it too? Why can't we have it both ways, where we both recognize the value of a genetic diagnosis and the specificity that a genetic syndrome identification may provide, while also recognizing the value in the concept of cerebral palsy as a major neuromotor developmental disorder. And I think that, as an example, CP, in some ways, when you think about genetic forms of CP, ultimately it's looking more and more like these are going to be a collection of rare disorders, individually rare conditions that collectively lead to a very common, or relatively common, clinical picture that we all see. But I would argue that there's probably no reason that individuals and families in particular, to bring it back to something that Gabler said earlier, can't benefit from both this relatively common diagnostic label and a rare disorder label at the same time. I think they can both be informative and both be helpful. And I think our families are growing and increasingly sophisticated and asking fantastic questions and advocating for their children.
We know we've run over time, but that's your fault. And we did have permission actually to carry on for another couple of minutes. So I think Michael has summed it up, I think, very well. I would just like to make a couple of general comments to challenge all of us who work with people with cerebral palsy. That cerebral palsy classically is due to a non-progressive lesion, but cerebral palsy is a progressive condition because children with cerebral palsy become older and become adults, and obviously the same way as all of us in this room are progressing and changing, and some of us are aging. I think there's a huge challenge to us clinically to figure out whether the changes we see in people with time are related to their cerebral palsy, as sadly is the common brush off of adults with problems like pain or whatever, or whether that is part of being is it part of being an adult? Is it part of being an adult with cerebral palsy? And we really don't understand a lot of that. So the challenge about progressive conditions, as was alluded to earlier, I think is still a huge challenge. The second comment I would make is that we are quite comfortable, I think, to recognize cretinism as a form of cerebral palsy due to a particular recognized impairment of iodine deficiency in a pregnant woman, leading to a triad of hearing impairment, spasticity, and intellectual disability. We don't even think about that. So I think it's quite reasonable for us to expect that as the frontiers continue to evolve, we will understand what is under the surface of the clinical picture and have clearer, hopefully clearer understanding of the natural history, the unnatural history if we start to intervene, the potential for intervention as we heard in the previous conversation or the previous talk. And so for me, this is an orthogonal kind of set of considerations, that there are clinical issues that we see in young people who become older people about whom we know very little. And some of them have particular genetic underpinnings that may be etiologically related. So I don't think we want to be anti-Semitic. That's a joke. But I will finish with a story I told Michael, which is, for those of you who are Jewish, you will know the stories from Chelm. And Chelm is an area in Poland inhabited by people of rather simple mentality. And the story is, and this is relevant, by the way, as you'll see, Chaim Yankel comes home one day and says, Rachel, good news, the surveyors are in town, and Chelm is on the border between Russia and Poland, and it's in Russia, and she says to him, Chaim Yankel, you're, as usual, talking in riddles. He says, Rachel, don't you realize they're looking at where the border is? Chaim Yankel, I really don't understand. He says, Rachel, they just found out they've moved the border. Chelm is no longer in Russia. She says, no more Russian winters. And I think that it's not a bad metaphor for what we're talking about. You know, and I think we've got to stop being reductionistic about this. Anyway, thank you all for your engagement and participation.